Welcome to the Lazy CEO Podcast, where Jim Schleckser, author of Great CEOs Are Lazy and founder of the CEO Project, features compelling experts and topics for CEOs of mid to large-size companies. Now, let's get started with the show.
Welcome, everybody, to another Lazy CEO podcast. My name is Jim Schleckser. I am your host, and I am the founder of the CEO Project. Today, we've got an awesome guest, and she's going to help us with kind of a life skill, not only useful as leaders, but useful in our personal lives and kind of everywhere we go. So today we have with us Sheila Heen, and I'm going to just read a little bit of her bio, which is exceptional. She helps people with difficult conversations. She founded a group called Triad Consulting Group with Doug Stone, and they help leaders and individuals with human-centered skills that help them get along and deal with difficult topics together. They offer workshops on negotiation, difficult conversations, feedback, and so forth. She has 30 years of experience and research at Harvard Negotiating Project. For those that you probably read the book, Getting to Yes, one of my favorite books on negotiating. She co-authored 2 best-selling books. This one, Difficult Conversations, 3rd edition, just came out a little while ago, and Thanks for the Feedback. Both great books. I've read them both recently. Actually, I think I read Difficult Conversations a while ago. As I read it, I'm like, man, this is really familiar. So she continues to work on the skills for building current and future generations as a professor of practice at Harvard Law School, where she leads negotiation and advises on the program on negotiation. 3rd edition just came out a little while ago, and she's going to learn us a whole bunch of new stuff. So Sheila, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
I'm totally delighted to be here. And I love the idea of learning us, right? Which is actually what we show up for. It's like, gosh, if I could get some new insights into old challenges, that would be kind of a relief, right?
Yeah, I think you should start every one of your classes at Harvard with, okay, I'm going to learn you all something this year. And they'll be like, am I in the right class? What happened?
Yeah, exactly. Who the heck gave her?
So what drew you to this question of difficult conversations and then the related topic of feedback, which can be sometimes difficult to receive? So what drew you to this area of research, and you've really committed your whole life to it? So
I have, which I'm not sure whether I knew that that's where that was going at the time. So I showed up to Harvard Law School as a student, and I had been told by my college advisor, like, they have this negotiation thing there, and I think it might be your deal. So we get one elective during that first year, and I took negotiation from Roger Fisher, who wrote Getting to Yes. And I just fell in love with the field. I just thought I could learn something. I could be learned every day. And in terms of what drew us to difficult conversations, of course, I was having my own difficult conversations in my own life. And I had all these negotiation skills because I quickly became an intern and a research assistant and a teaching fellow and all of that in the program. But I was still having my own challenges. At the time, I was in one of those on again, off again relationships that we kept breaking up and getting back together. The ones that I had always thought were so ridiculous.
Yeah, and there you are in one, right?
And now I'm in one. And I'm thinking, I'm like a negotiation person. Why can't I get agreement here? And it took me kind of too long to realize this is not a negotiation. We don't have to agree that we should break up. He doesn't agree that we should break up, but I get to actually make that decision. This is a BATNA, not a negotiation.
Yep.
And so Getting to Yes talks about separating the people from the problem. And I think what I was wrestling with, well, what happens when it feels like the people are the problem? And what about when there's so little trust, or there's so much frustration, or there's so much history in the relationship, or we have such strong disagreement that we're having trouble actually understanding even why we're having such a problem, or why you see it the way you do, because it seems ridiculous to me.
Yep.
So that's what led us to difficult conversations. And then 15 years later, we had been on the hunt for what is the next big question for us. And of course, one of the kinds of difficult conversations that comes up with every single group we ever work with is feedback.
Yep.
And in particular, how hard it is to receive feedback from all the people around you, formal and informal, right?
Yep.
Spoken and unspoken.
Yep.
So that it's been a journey of like, what's the next thing that I personally need to understand in my own life, right? That's what really drives all of us.
So is this like Sheila's therapy in the form of books over the
Yeah,
last 30
yes,
years?
exactly. Feel free to join me
Yeah.
for my
It's
next
kind of a group process. It's
set
all
of
good.
problems. Yes, exactly.
Just touching on feedback for a second, I've always, people talk about love, and I ask them, what's the opposite of love? And they go, hate. I'm like, no, it's ambivalence. If I just don't care. That's the opposite of love. And so when somebody is willing to give you feedback, it is generally more on the love side, right? If I don't care, I just won't bother, right? I won't tell you have broccoli in your teeth. And so when I hear feedback, even though I hate it sometimes,
Yeah.
I go, they're actually making a real effort to try to love on me a little bit. So feedback is a gift is the phrase, right? But I really genuinely, I think if you embrace that they're actually trying to love on me, believe it or not. Now there's always like feedback, like a little air quote feedback, which is aggressive and negative, but genuinely given feedback, that's a thing of love, actually.
It is. It's at least a reflective of investment.
Okay, I'll
Like
buy that.
whether I like you or not, it might be that we're stuck together on this project and we cannot screw it up, but you're the one who is, right? So that's but it does reflect, I think, investment in each other or what we're doing together.
Yep.
In a way that, well, it's what leads us to say that feedback is a gift. And the question that we had was, well, then how come it doesn't feel like a gift
Yeah.
time?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that question, not how do I give feedback more effectively, which is the question I think all of us have asked and gotten training on, but maybe we're going about it backwards, and we should be thinking about what is so hard for all of us about receiving feedback, about all the ways in which other people in our lives want us to change. And I actually think that can be among the most painful experiences in our lives.
Yeah, well, no doubt. And I think it takes a great deal of, and this, when I was reading through the books, and then we're going to get to difficult conversations in a minute here, specifically, but in both cases, a high degree of emotional intelligence to be able to parse issue from emotion and manage emotion as I get, like, which could be very difficult feedback to hear. I mean, you have to be a pretty high EQ person to be successful at that, I thought.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that has changed a lot in the 30 years that I have been teaching, um, is that the role of emotions is such a more legitimate topic, a more recognized topic, especially in academia, that if you're going to do something effectively, you need to actually be paying attention to other human beings. And I mean, I teach in a law school, like we're trying to influence other people. If you're not paying attention to the ways in which they react or resist, or disagree or get stuck arguing in their own position, then you're not actually good at what you do. You're not going to be good at what you do.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's go to difficult conversations. I loved sort of the first model or element of it, of that you're really having three conversations here.
Yeah.
So why don't you run us through that? Because I thought that was really different and insightful.
Yeah. So the first insight, I think that we came to, and this really comes from Chris Argyris and practitioners in the action science field,
Yep.
is that if you really want to understand a difficult conversation, you have to listen beyond what people are saying and take a look at what they're really thinking and feeling and often not saying. Because for hierarchy reasons and self-preservation reasons, there are all sorts of reasons that we don't say what we're really thinking and feeling. But if we're going to understand what's going on beneath the surface, we need kind of that X-ray to look at the internal voice.
Yep.
The second insight that we had was that, gosh, when you do look at the internal voice in conflict, there are very predictable places that our internal voices go in terms of what we're preoccupied with. And you can bucket those into three conversations that are happening at once.
Right.
The first is what we call the what happened conversation. which is the story I have about what has happened up until this point, what is happening right now while I'm trying to talk to you about this, and what I think should happen in the future. So this is sort of my narrative, and that narrative itself has three subcomponents that are predictable. One is that I tend to be preoccupied with what I am right about, who's right, but particularly what I'm right about.
Yep.
The second is I want to know whose fault it is that we're having this problem.
I used to joke in meetings. I go, most importantly, let's figure out who's at fault.
Who
It
to
was
blame?
meant to be a
Who to point a
complete,
finger at?
like, right. That was a complete
Yes.
joke. When people go down that, I'm like, this is super important that we figure out who's at fault. And they go, oh yeah, maybe it isn't that important, right?
Yeah. But it's naturally sitting at the back of our minds. Like, why am I in this stressful situation and conversation to begin with?
Yep.
The third piece of that is like, what's motivating you? What are your intentions? Like, why are you acting this way? Is it because you are fill in the blank, right? And intention over time, when we're frustrated with each other, intention becomes characteristics, and characteristics becomes character.
Yep.
Because that's just the kind of guy you are.
Yep.
So that all makes up our story about what's happening and what should happen. And of course, our stories are very different, which is why we're butting heads. But there are two more things going on beneath the surface. That the second conversation we're having with ourselves is, what do I do with the emotions I'm feeling? What do I do with my strong reactions? And particularly in the workplace, thinking, gosh, being emotional is not going to help me.
Right.
So I try to leave that out of the equation until it builds up so much that then it bursts on the scene in ways that are even more damaging sometimes. And then at the deepest level is what we call the identity conversation.
Yep.
If a conversation feels difficult, chances are there's something the situation says about me which feels like it's at stake. Am I competent or incompetent? Am I trusted or not trusted? Do you think I'm being fair or I'm being very deeply unfair? And that if you have trouble saying no, it's not just no, the word no, it's that you think of yourself as someone who's a team player, who would never abandon a colleague in need or a friend and family member in need. And if that's your self-story, your identity, well, then saying no is doing something that feels pretty in conflict with who you want to be in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's go to each of those, and the sort of what you spent a fair amount of time in and you mentioned Chris, but the systems thinking model of what really happened, right? Let's really, I think being a systems, I'm huge on systems thinking. I actually think I wrote an article strategy is systems thinking.
Yes. Ooh, it better be.
So good strategists are good system thinkers, right?
Yes.
But you really spent some time on that in terms of the what is happening. And I loved it as a relatively neutral way to help us both understand what's really going on here. I mean, I could almost imagine, let's draw what really happened in a little diagram and see if we can get alignment on that using the ladder of inference that you pulled from Senge, of course, right? Like,
from Senge, and before that from Chris Ardress and Shine.
Yep, exactly correct. Yes.
It. So yeah, I think part of the shift, so the first conversation really that you have to have is a conversation with yourself to shift your own internal voice.
Okay.
From that sense of certainty about what I'm right about and whose fault it is and why you're acting this way in particular, to some curiosity, to the first question isn't who's right. The first question I need to answer is, why do we see this so differently? Are we looking at different things? Are we seeing the same thing and interpreting them differently based on our past experience?
Right.
Do we have different predictions about what's going to happen? If the first question is, let's just understand why we see it so differently, then we're going to have a more productive conversation. We may not agree at the end of it, but we will understand why we don't agree. And we might have an idea about how to test whose prediction is more reliable or get some more input. The other thing is shifting from who's to blame to how did we each contribute to this problem, which is that deep systems question.
Right.
We each did things or failed to do things that got us here. And there are probably at least two players in this. There are probably other players and there are other factors in the environment, right? The cost of materials changed and we didn't expect that. That contributed. And contribution doesn't necessarily mean 50-50. Often it's 90-10, but if I can, that's important for two reasons. One is if I can see my 10%, that's what I have control over changing to see whether I get a different outcome. Right. Also, if I'm willing to own my own contribution, because reciprocity is one of the strongest social norms.
Yep.
And robust findings in the literature, if I attack you, you're going to attack me back. But if I'm willing to own, look, there are some things I wish I had done differently here, and that I intend to do differently going forward. I'd just like to understand how we got here. You're more likely to get the message. This is not a blame conversation. And you'll reciprocate that, well, okay, I probably need to do some things differently as well. So that we can have an honest conversation about how do we change what we're each contributing to that system, because we're each reacting to each other.
Yep.
So that we just land in a different place next week, next month, next year.
Yeah. I love, as for leaders, I always love Deming on this, right? It's always management's fault. And so if you go in with that attitude that as a leader, if something screwed up, I'm clearly did something wrong. Like I'm clearly at fault at some level here because it shouldn't be like this and I own it. And I think that's super productive when you have these conversations around feedback. Like, how did I help create a situation that caused this to happen or not give guidance? Or clearly I did something to help make this happen. So let's figure out how to make that better. And I think your law of reciprocity, that plays very well when we're trying to solve an issue that even in my head, I might say it's 90% you, but I have to own my 10. Like you go in owning 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 or 100.
And also the 10 is clear to me, but I really can't see how it could be more. But in the conversation, suddenly you're letting me know the other things that you were hoping I would do that I didn't do or whatever. And I'm like, oh, maybe I had a bigger problem.
Okay. It might've been 25.
Maybe 22. We can agree on that. So, but I think so often I hear leaders say part of our problem here is that we need more accountability on this team. And their instinctive answer for how to do that is to put blame more front and center. Or they swing the other way and they say, well, blame isn't productive. Everybody tries to avoid being blamed and it wastes a lot of time and energy, which is true. So they say, okay, we're not going to blame anybody. But then you get people saying these crazy things like, well, I'm not saying this is anybody's fault, but like, Jim, if you could not screw that up next time, that'd be helpful.
Right? Really appreciated.
You've got to replace the instinct to blame with something else that is more constructive and helpful. And so the shift to joint contribution assumes we all had a part in this, and our purpose is to actually solve the problem rather than to, pin somebody down or punish them, whether formally or informally.
But I think that requires assuming good intent as well, right? Nobody's malicious here. They just either didn't know but they all had good intent to do the right thing. And we just got to figure out what went wrong. But I don't walk around thinking, well, Sheila's a bad human being because she didn't get the bills out on time or whatever the issue is.
Sheila might be a bad human being, but the bills maybe were incidental. I think on the intent piece, I do think that we infer intentions from the impact on us. So like you're driving me crazy. So clearly you are the kind of person who means to do that. And it's interesting. I do think that pulling those apart and saying, look, the bottom line is I don't know your intentions. They're invisible to me. I do actually know the impact you're having, which is the problem that I actually am concerned about. So let's just pull them apart. Let's talk about the impact, and I'll leave open the question of why you were doing what you were doing, and I'll leave that to you to explain.
Right.
I think assuming good intent often is helpful, and then people get to a point where like, yeah, but they keep doing it over and over when they know it drives me crazy, so I can't assume that anymore. And my assumption would be more, I don't really understand your intentions. So then I can have some curiosity about, we've talked about this like 17 times. So why are you still doing it? Help me understand that.
Yeah.
Because impact actually is the thing that is making me crazy and the team.
Well, but I love the impact thing because then I go back to, so we talked about the impact. Do you not agree?
Yeah.
That has this horrible bad impact? Or, like, is that not important to you? Is it like, help me understand why you keep doing it if you understand the impact, which is very negative.
Exactly. And I think that two things are often true in that situation. One is that they might understand the impact intellectually.
Right.
But it's really hard to understand your impact on someone else viscerally. like how disruptive it was for the rest of the team, or how frustrating it was, and how many hours it took.
Mm.
And how many of those team members don't want to work with you anymore. And why? Because you experience yourself as like a lovely, wonderful person to work with. You're very effective. And you might be a lot of the time, but that 10% when you're not is what drives people off the team.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a little bit crossing over into the feedback book, but we have a natural blind spot about what it's really like for other people when we impact them negatively.
Yep.
And the second thing that's often happening is it's just a little more complicated than when I'm on the other side of it, I think it is. So they might say, oh, I think that is an important impact, but what you're not paying attention to is that if we do it this other way, there's a different impact that I'm protecting us from.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but that's the systems thinking.
That's the systems thinking. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. You have to see it as an interactive system.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I love all that. I was actually dealing with somebody recently that got to describe the culture as a pit of vipers would not be too severe, right? And they're saying,
yeah. Yeah.
and they
Yeah.
said, how can we get to a point where people, what was they going for? It was, lack of, they're trying to get away from shame and blame and so forth. And I go, look, my answer was replace it with every mistake is a learning opportunity. So it's screwed up. We go, great. What can we learn from this so we don't do it again? No shame, no blame. It's just learning, right? And the more we learn, the better we get. And so, but nobody gets fired for making a mistake. And in this particular organization, they'll preface what I would consider not a very negative comment. And they'll go, I might get fired for this, but it's like the precursor to every statement. It is not, like I said, pit of vipers. It is a horrible, but the idea of learning, I said, well, maybe that could make them a baby step in the right direction.
Well, and you're actually packed into that little window, that little snapshot, is when we talk about contribution, it's often, okay, who did or didn't do the following, the action, right? You didn't flag this as a problem ahead of time, so you should have said something, so this is your fault.
Right.
Packed into that is like, well, why didn't you flag it ahead of time? Sounds like you thought you might be fired if you did. So what messages is the culture sending about whether you can or should speak up and what the consequences might be? So it's also in a systems way looking beyond the choices people make to also think about why did they make those choices and do we need to change those incentives?
Yeah. And I just don't think they have organizational maturity to have that systems thinking conversation, because then leadership would have to take an ownership element in the problem, and they just don't want to do that.
Yes. And so you're pointing out also that I think for leaders, it's hard to understand how to the extent to which you live out loud. And
Oh, yeah.
all of your signals are incredibly loud in the ecosystem. And you're just thinking like, oh, I'm just Sheila and I don't know what I'm doing, so like, we'll figure it out. But you're not paying attention to the fact that the choices that you make tell people the choices they should make.
100%. The when I got my first president's job was actually up in Boston, not far from you. Fabulous guy I worked for. He goes, Jim, welcome to the job. Everything matters.
Yeah.
Everything matters now. Every meeting you go to or not go to, who you spend time with, who you don't spend time with, it all matters, because everybody's going to interpret it as a signal and have meaning. And so you just don't realize, well, I'm just Jim, right? I'm just this guy. And not anymore. Sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that people look at leadership and what they see is like a throne on top of the world.
Yeah.
They see you sitting up there on your throne. But when you're on that throne or in one of those leadership chairs, that's not how it feels. How it feels is like Atlas, that you're carrying the world on your back. And it just feels like overwhelming responsibility. And so it's interesting how much the perspective shifts just by changing chairs.
Interesting. So moving over to the emotional part of this conversation, the word that struck me as you talked about that is empathy.
Yeah.
So my ability to understand how you're feeling as a result of this conversation may be part of the answer, or maybe not. I mean, help me understand how we deal with the emotions that get generated by a conversation like this.
Yeah. Well, by the time something becomes a difficult conversation, chances are we actually have two problems. We've got the surface problem, which is what strategy are we going to choose or whatever, who gets this resource? but we often have a deeper second problem, which is how I feel treated in this relationship. Because so-and-so always gets that resource, or you never listen or weigh what I have to say the way that you should, given my experience, right? And so if we just always stick to business and solve the surface problem, that surface problem may go away, because we made the decision and we moved on, but this is sitting underneath the surface, just waiting to come out in the next topic that comes to the
Sure.
table.
Yeah.
So that question of how do we each feel treated in the relationship and what meaning do we make about how we're being treated, is the deeper problem. That if we can actually get to that, that's what changes working relationships to help strengthen them and help us actually take advantage of the combination, the you plus me synergies that are possible, that right now are actually detracting and hindering each other rather than additive. And I think that often these days when I'm teaching the emotions piece, I'm borrowing also from my colleagues. So Roger Fisher teamed up with a guy, Dan Shapiro, late in Roger's career to look at the role of emotion in working relationships. And their book, Beyond Reason, identifies some core relational interests. They call them core concerns. That if there's friction in the relationship, chances are some of these are being stepped on. So it's like autonomy, what should I get to decide versus you are interfering with that, turf wars.
Right.
Affiliation, am I in or am I out, which implicates belonging
Right.
and inclusion. Appreciation, am I seen and valued by somebody? Status, are you weighing what I have to say about different topics the way I think you should?
Yep.
And that can change conversation to conversation depending on what we're deciding and we're talking about. And role, which is, do I have a role that I like, I'm good at, and people value in the organization? If those things are in good repair, you've got strong working relationships. If any of them are getting stepped on, then you start to have reactivity, frustration, mistrust. And I've found that to be a very helpful checklist for just understanding what's going wrong.
Yeah, we're going to put a link to Beyond Reason in this too, because that sounds like a great book.
It's a great book.
The thing that, as I'm listening to this, I'm just, who has responsibility for the emotional reaction when we're having a difficult conversation? And is each individual responsible for their own reaction? I've got to have the EQ to be able to go, oh, I'm feeling like my autonomy is being stepped on. And now I could service it, but it seems to me that as a leader in particular, the more productive conversation might be for me to say, Sheila, I could understand in having this conversation that I'm taking some resources away from that. You might feel like I'm questioning your role or I'm trying to remove, autonomy. I'm not. I'm doing it for these other reasons. But I deeply understand why you might feel that way. Is that a useful way to go after it? Or do you go, look, everybody owns their own emotions, deal with it yourself?
So you're explaining your intent. That's not why I'm doing what I'm doing, but it doesn't necessarily change the impact if they feel that you are actually interfering. And I mean, I agree with you that people need to take responsibility for their reactions to things. At the same time, if you're having a reaction to how I'm going about it, I still have a problem, whether or not you're willing to own it.
Sure.
And so in terms of my trying to influence you, right, and to persuade you to get on board or whatever it is that I'm trying to do with you and that I need your cooperation or buy-in for. Yes, partly your reaction is your responsibility, but it's also my problem. So
how do I deal with it then? I mean, I tried to be empathetic there, but you may or may not be able to crawl in somebody's head and at least appreciate their feelings. I can't change them, but I can appreciate them.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do as sort of an advanced listening exercise in negotiation programs is going beyond good listening and bad listening. Obviously, I need to be doing good listening.
Yep.
And then we split it and we say, okay, what are you listening for? So one person listen for what happened, what were the intentions, it's the facts, the what happened piece. Second person, your job is actually to listen for the feelings.
Mm.
How are they feeling about this? What is frustrating about it? Have their feelings changed over time, etc. Those two people listening to a talker talk about a frustrating situation will naturally ask different questions
Mm.
and go to different places.
Mm.
And as a leader, you need to actually be able to move smoothly between and deftly between the two. Because if I'm trying to solve the problem and you're resisting and reacting, there's something going on that I'm not getting, and I need to shift over into listening for feelings and the meaning behind those feelings so that I can just understand where are we going wrong so that we can actually get aligned with each other on that front. If you feel like I'm micromanaging you,
Right.
I may have a different set of assumptions and implicit rules about how involved I should be, but let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Because if we can get aligned on that, well, then solving the problem is easy. Because hopefully we have the same goal anyway. But we can talk about how to get there best.
I mean,
And that answer might be different with you than it is with someone else, for me as a leader. Yeah.
I mean, is it appropriate when we're having this difficult conversation for me to actually go there and say, Sheila, what I'm feeling when you say this to me and these decisions you're trying to make is X, Y, Z. And I'm not trying to have you solve it. I just need to get it out there because you're making me feel very underappreciated right now. Is that a useful way to do it? And it just feels like it'd have to be in a hugely safe environment to be able to even do that. But
when people talk about psychological safety,
yep.
Partly they're talking about the extent to which team members feel that they can be open about, number one, their contribution to the problem, volunteer that information and own it.
Yep.
And they feel like, oh, that's seen as positive and competent and learning, not as great, now we figured out who to blame.
Thank you. You made that easy.
Yeah, exactly. That's number one. And number two, they feel that they can be open about what is going on for them that is getting in the way of what we're trying to do together. And I do think that there's a huge difference between being emotional and describing the emotions that are active or relevant here.
Right.
So being emotional looks and sounds like yelling, crying, blaming. Emotion often gets translated into attacks, blaming, accusations, etc.
Right.
Describing emotion is like, okay, I don't know, I'm exhausted, I'm confused, I feel like we're going in circles. There's something here I'm not getting about why this is so important to you. Can you help me understand that?
Right.
And I think just naming that very calmly, people won't even realize that you're naming emotions because you're just naming the heart of what's really going on, which is a really
interesting. Maybe touching on the last one before we close out is the identity implications.
Yeah.
In a two-party conversation, I'm not sure how do you help the other person on the identity thing? Maybe that's the question. Or how do they help themselves on the identity thing?
Yeah. In a lot of ways, the feedback book is a deep dive on the identity front. Because it takes a look at the triggered reactions we have when people want us to change.
Right.
And I should probably back up and just say, when we say identity has come to refer to identities around gender and race and sexuality, etc. And that's included because it's also like, are you saying this because I fill in the blank? That's included.
Right.
But it also is the bigger category that includes, am I a good person or a bad person? Am I the problem here? Am I competent or incompetent? Am I worthy of respect or worthy of love in personal relationships?
Right.
And often that feels like it's at stake. Now, sometimes the biggest insight there just helps me to ground myself in the conversation. To say, okay, it sounds like they feel like I handled this badly. We tend to hold our identity as two either or, black and white. Like either I'm 100% competent all the time, or I'm totally incompetent. And that's just not realistic. Of course, there's something I may have contributed to the problem. If I can accept that and say, if I can learn from this, that'll be a win.
Right.
And it's not that I'm doing nothing right. well, then I'm less reactive myself in the conversation, whether or not we talk about it directly.
Got it.
The other thing is just to listen for what did they hear me saying about who they are. And that gives us the opportunity just to help them ground themselves, to say like, look, let's be clear, you are doing 90% of the job amazingly well. Part of
Yeah.
the reason I wanted to talk is that this felt very uncharacteristic.
Mm.
Or this, I think, is your learning edge. Like if you want to move to the next role, this is the place where like, let's do a little bit of work. Because you got everything else in spades, like awesome. But this is the place where in these moments it gets in the way. It helps me help them get perspective so that they can really hear what we're talking about and that it's not all or nothing.
Yeah. Interesting. I like that sort of reinforcement of the positive, despite the fact that we're having a tough conversation on one front, right?
Yeah.
Which helps not challenge their identity. Not
Yeah.
as much, at least.
Not as much, at least. And sometimes just by naming it, you can acknowledge like, look, this is a tough conversation for both of us.
Yep.
I feel like you're accusing me of not being fair, and you feel like I wasn't fair or didn't feel like you should be included in a way that was upsetting in this meeting. So it's tough. This is a tough conversation for both of us, and both of the things are important. So let's figure out why we had such different assumptions about whether you should be included.
You know, and maybe last comment on the identity thing is there, when I was reading through it, I thought about sort of resilience and fragility.
Yeah.
Right. And there's some people that are, let's say, fragile in their identity, that any challenge feels like I tapped the glass and the cracks started, shooting in every direction.
Yeah.
And other people, I could thump on them a bunch and nothing's going to happen. They're kind of, I'm comfortable in my skin. I am who I am. And, so that they come to the table with resilience or fragility in that conversation.
And I think we can make connections to a bunch of different work on that front.
Mm-hmm.
One is just that there are phases of life where you're more and less fragile or vulnerable. So in my 20s, when I made a mistake, it was a disaster.
Yeah.
Because it was a suggestion that I was not up to this being a professional thing. And I need to just move back to Nebraska and move in with my parents.
And sleep on the couch.
And sleep on the couch. And I think sometimes when we complain about the younger generations being so reactive and whatever, it's just that we're in different phases of figuring out who we are. In my 50s, when I make a mistake, I'm like, shoot, another mistake. It's not upsetting. I should have known better by now, but I at least have a story that like I can recover from this. And the important thing is, do I learn from it?
Mm-hmm.
And that connects, of course, to the Carol Dweck work on fixed identity or fixed mindset and growth mindset. And what I've come to understand that I didn't initially about that work is it's not just that there are people who are fixed and people who are growth. Those mindsets are a negotiation with myself. And I move from this is an indictment about who I am to this is input about the next thing I need to learn. And I can actually negotiate myself into a growth mindset from a fixed mindset, which is my first reaction.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, fabulous. I think you learned us some stuff. So this was great.
Including bad grammar. We taught
including horrible grammar, intentional horrible grammar to make the point. So just maybe last question. What do you do for fun, Sheila?
Oh, gosh. Well, one of the things that I do for fun is I try to get a long walk in the woods every day. I've got a couple of dogs that encourage that as an avoidance of an evening of, craziness. But I do think that just spending a little bit of quiet time outside for me is very good for my mental health and just my focus the rest of the time.
Nice. I couldn't agree more. I get outside a couple of days a week and it changes you. It
Totally does.
Yeah. My dermatologist isn't as thrilled about that as
yes.
But well, awesome. And if people want to get more of the work you do, do they go to Triad? And if so, what's the best way to do that? Can you give us some connection?
So the advantage of having a very unique name is that I'm very easy to find.
Yep.
If you Google Sheila Heen, you will find us and triadconsultinggroup.com. We have a section of the website called Help Yourself that has suggestions for books to read, worksheets to download to prepare for a tough conversation, articles, etc. So yeah, that's where I would point people.
Tremendous. Well, Sheila, thank you so much. This was enjoyable and tremendous learning opportunity, and I appreciate you taking the time. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. This podcast is brought to you by the CEO Project. At the CEO Project, we work with CEOs to help them grow their business. And our members represent billions of dollars of revenue and profit. And frankly, amongst all of us, we've probably made every mistake in the book, including some you haven't made yet. So if you want to learn from the experience of a bunch of really seasoned CEOs, we're a great place to hang out. In this podcast, what you're going to hear are some of those ideas, concepts, and things that are just going to help you on your journey. If you want to find out more, reach out to us at theceoproject.com, or you can contact me personally at jim@theceoproject.com. Happy listening.
Thanks for listening to the Lazy CEO podcast. We'll see you next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes and check out our website, www.theceoproject.com.